This is the Sports Bash Warm-Up with Josh Hennig on 97.3 ESPN. Now, live inside the Matt Black Kia Studios, here's Josh Hennig.
Desean would have to go through some issues with Jeffrey Lurie and talk to him, and he did. And Howie Roseman, obviously. It goes far beyond them both being Jewish. It's just that you talk about contrition. It's very, very important when people are outraged at something that he didn't say it. He used someone else's quotes on Instagram. In social media, it sets off a wildfire, and it's also a bad image for the football team. And you add it all up, Sean's roster spot clearly was in trouble on Tuesday. I would just say, going forward over the next couple of days, a couple of weeks, Mike, just move this forward here. He's in an evaluation period of how he handles himself.
That was Adam Kaplan, NFL Insider, yesterday. Football at 4 on the Sports Bash. Adam Kaplan joins Mike Gill, Hunter Brody every Thursday for Football at 4, Inside the Birds podcast, InsideTheBirds.com. I'm Josh Hennig. This is 97.3 ESPN. Text board is open for you at 609-403-0973. One of the bigger news stories, and I know for some people it may not be a massive news story, but there's a little bit new news right now on the Desean Jackson front. So we'll be getting that. Plus UFC 251, not one, not two, but 3 title fights tomorrow night. Live from UFC Fight Island, Brett Okamoto, ESPN MMA reporter, will join us coming up at 1:25 to preview the card. But I did want to start off the jump here on Desean Jackson, because as the week has progressed, it feels like, despite the fact that we live in a world that is a lot of immediacy, right? You could put something out on social media, it's immediately accessible. You tweet, you Instagram, you Facebook, you Snapchat, you TikTok, whatever platform you're using, you can get your message. YouTube, get your message out there pretty daggone quickly if you want to. In a world where everything is immediate, you can make your mac and cheese in a minute or less in the microwave. It feels like this Desean Jackson situation has kind of been moving along just very slowly, like molasses. It's like very slowly matriculating down the lane. But part of the news today was Julian Edelman. Julian Edelman came out a couple days ago and stated that, he wanted to work with Desean Jackson so they can share in each other's culture. Well, Julian Edelman tweeted 5 hours ago that he and Desean Jackson spoke for a while last night, he says on Twitter. We're making plans to use our experiences to educate one another and grow together. Stay tuned. And he tagged Desean Jackson in the tweet. And the reason why this is a interesting culmination of the week to me is because one of the problems that's happened this week is there's been a lot of people just yelling very loudly about this Desean Jackson situation. And that's why I love the way Adam Kaplan really encapsulated everything yesterday on the Sports Bash, because Adam, who's been covering the NFL for a long time, he understands probably as well, if not better than anybody who covers the league, that there's a lot of layers to this. And I love how he said, it's not just because Jeffrey Lurie and Howie Roseman have Jewish heritage, that there's more to this issue with Desean Jackson. Part of the problem with this situation with Desean Jackson this week has been the fact that it feels like there has not been a lot of response when it comes to this situation. There's been a handful of guys who have, in certain ways, come to Desean's defense, and others who have spoken out very vocally. But at the end of the day, Desean has to work with people in order to move forward. He has to put himself in a situation where he understands why what he did was a mistake. And as Adam Kaplan said, listen, Desean Jackson is a good person, but he has to show that he gets that he made a mistake.
Just knowing what I know about Desean and knowing that he's a pretty good person, but he made a terrible mistake and what he's going to need to do going forward. And I thought we pretty much laid out where the Eagles were and Deshaun's side as well. So it was very, I called it down the middle. It's just basically he's got to show that he gets it and it's going to do the right thing. But because of the COVID shutdown, the things that he'd like to do, he can't really do right now because he's not here.
And that's the key. The real reason why this is all moving along slowly is because in order for Desean or any athlete to really step up if they made a mistake, if they said something, if they shared something that is hateful, derogatory, etc., we live in a world now where it's a lot easier to put your message out there, but it's a lot harder to actually deal with the message that you put out there. Desean has now apologized multiple times. But as someone else put it, I'm going to, kind of reappropriate this comment. There's a difference between apologizing and atoning for what you did. And Deshaun's not in a position right now, like a lot of people are, to do certain things because, well, this pandemic has pretty much shut down half the country in one way or another. I know some people have said, listen, Desean needs to be punished for what he did and not realizing what he did was wrong. But part of the problem with punishing Desean is that there are other players as well who don't seem to get that message. Desean Jackson, I don't know if he still fully gets the hate that was being propagated. Guys like Malik Jackson and Marquise Goodwin, they're defending and they're liking each other's posts, but they don't seem to get the message either. And I think that the lack of understanding of what happened here was really capped off this morning. I was listening to Golic and Wingo every morning here on 97.3 ESPN, and they had Lane Johnson on. Lane Johnson, Desean Jackson's teammate. And Lane was asked straight up, no leading questions, no trying to get him to say anything. Just straight up asked him to comment on this Desean Jackson situation this week, and this is what Lane said.
It's unfortunate. I've had a chance to talk to Desean. We talked about it as a team. Obviously, racism and injustice doesn't have a place in society, but ultimately, I think, as far as growing and learning, this will be a learning experience for him.
A learning experience. That's an incredible contrast to what former Eagle Chris Long said on his own podcast when he was asked about it. You have one guy who's Desean's teammate saying, well, this is a learning experience for him. And while, yes, you need to learn from your mistakes, as Chris Long said, this is actually a disaster. And I think that it's being overlooked that it is a disaster. This is Chris Long on Desean Jackson's quoting of a fake Hitler quote.
Somehow managed to use a fake Hitler quote doing it. And that is a disaster. And I can't speak for the many people in the media or on Twitter who kind of bite their tongue on this thing because when it comes to anti-Semitism, it's not in vogue to denounce it. Or, they have some geopolitical inclination or political inclination that complicates denouncing it.
Complicates denouncing it. And I think that's where the problem is. The news came out this week, conveniently, that Jeff Lurie is coming out with a documentary about Hitler and about Nazi Germany and about, the white supremacy that was propagated by Hitler and by the Nazi regime. And I don't think it's a coincidence why this is important and why this upsets Jeffrey Lurie, as has been documented by many people who cover the team, from Adam Kaplan to Jeff Mosher and others. I feel like the people who are closest to Desean don't understand or don't fully want to say that what he did was, well, like Chris Long just said, a disaster. I think at some point, I hope that we can move on from this. But part of the problem is that as we've had this intersection between sports and the real world, partly because there hasn't been sports for a few months aside from some UFC fights and NASCAR and golf events. And part of the problem is because of the fact that we all live on social media now because we actually can't see and talk to each other more often than not. All of this stuff has become, well, can you encapsulate your opinion in 240 characters or less? And I think that's completely unfair. I don't know Desean personally. I don't know him as a person. But Lane Johnson says good things about him. And Chris Long also says good things about Desean Jackson.
I like Desean. Every time I've been around him, seems like a really good guy. That was disappointing because maybe I don't get it. I saw a ton of people defending him on Twitter somehow, which is another reason why Twitter sucks a big fat. The guy made a mistake. It's a bad mistake. I don't know. It's not for me to decide, as I said, with the Drew Brees or something like that. I don't do the comparison thing with this stuff because it's also nuanced.
Chris Long is saying it up front. And I'll play this cut again from Adam Kaplan. Desean Jackson is a good person. Adam Kaplan has covered the NFL for 20 years.
Just knowing what I know about Desean and knowing that he's a pretty good person, but he made a terrible mistake and what he's going to need to do going forward. And I thought we pretty much laid out where the Eagles were and Deshaun's side as well. So it was very, I called it down the middle. It's just basically he's got to show that he gets it and it's going to do the right thing. But because of the COVID shutdown, the things that he'd like to do, he can't really do right now because he's not here.
Multiple people saying Desean Jackson's a good person. So the issue with what Desean Jackson put on social media and then his apologies afterward, these are not reflections on his character. And I think that's where people are missing the mark on this. Anybody who defends him quoting Hitler or spreading anti-Semitism are just as wrong as Desean is. And if anybody disagrees with that, I can't help you if you can't see that. But now's the point where how are we going to move forward? What are we going to do moving forward? We know there's a precedent, whether it's a good or bad precedent set by the Eagles in the past for players making mistakes, doing the wrong thing off the field. Riley Cooper said an unforgivable word. He was fined. He had to go to counseling and sensitivity training, etc. Michael Vick went to jail for what he did to those dogs. And then he spent the rest of his NFL career advocating against the thing that he did and educating people in communities that don't know better why dog fighting and violence against animals is wrong. So the Eagles have not one, but two players who have stepped up and said, I made a mistake. I'm going to do what it takes to rectify, or as I use the word, atone for my mistake. But part of the problem, as Chris Long said on his podcast, is that Desean Jackson doesn't have the same ripple effect problem that Riley Cooper had. Because Riley Cooper, he was surrounded by the people who what he said, his racist remark, using the N-word, has a negative effect on.
All I know is that Riley Cooper, the best way that he can come out of it better, if that's what we want somebody to change or learn from their mistakes. He kind of couldn't have a better crash course in learning from his mistakes than re-entering, a locker room full of black guys. And that's your career. Like, kind of awkward when that video surfaces and you got to go back to work. It almost do him a disservice to cut him. Maybe he would just kind of hang out with everybody that looks like him.
But the problem is that Desean doesn't have the same luxury. He can't walk into a locker room full of people who were offended by what he said, which complicates the situation. I'm a firm believer that you have to punish Desean somehow. You know, he can go with Julian Edelman to the National Holocaust Museum. He can spend time with the National Anti-Defamation League. He can go meet with some rabbis. He can do all these different things all he wants. But everything should have a consequence for every action that is made. The Eagles fined Riley Cooper. You have to at least find Desean Jackson, right? You have to at least make him show that he is truly contrite for his actions. But frankly, I'm a little bothered by Lane Johnson's comments this morning. Because he almost treated it as, well, we're all going to move forward from this. This was Lane Johnson on Golic and Wingo this morning.
You know, with every mistake that's made, this is a good opportunity for him to grow. I know a lot of people have reached out to him with that. So moving forward, man, he's apologized. I know he feels, heavy with his heart. He's upset a lot of people, but moving forward, man, I think this will be a good experience for him and way to move forward.
I understand that Lane Johnson has to walk a fine line. As he said earlier, I played the cut where he said, listen, we've all talked to Desean. We had a team meeting about this. But at some point also, we have to realize and just denounce what he did. And it bothers me on some level that Chris Long, former Eagle, obviously doesn't play with Desean Jackson this year, but he was very vocal and very coming out and saying, this was wrong, this is a disaster, he shouldn't have said this, etc. But Lane Johnson is using words like the learning experience will move forward, he'll grow from this. And I think that there is a strong disconnect, and that disconnect in society has really gotten out of control. Right is right and wrong is wrong. And the Eagles have to, in some way, no matter how contrite Desean is, no matter how I apologize, no matter how many things he does to rectify what he did, or is, again, the word atone for what he did, in some way the Eagles have to punish him on some level, because the precedent is already there. They have to do something. Now, whether you suspend him or not, I'm not going to sit here and demand he has to be suspended. But the Eagles need to at least put his feet to the line and say, see this line? If you step over this line again, there's going to be more consequences. And I think that is going to come because the owner is Jeff Lurie. Jeff Lurie, a guy who has supported Malcolm Jenkins in his battle against social injustice. A guy like Jeffrey Lurie who was willing to take the risk on a guy like Michael Vick and supported Michael Vick's efforts to basically fight against the culture that put him in a position to commit the evil things that he did against those dogs. Jeffrey Lurie has been behind his players on numerous occasions when it comes to issues, second chances, etc. And this is an important issue to Jeffrey Lurie. And I think that's why things are going to be okay. I think that's why Desean Jackson is going to be held accountable, because his owner has a track record of being fair and giving players a second chance. But if this owner wasn't Jeff Lurie, I think Desean Jackson would have a lot of problems. Because what Desean Jackson propagated on social media, the anti-Semitic remarks, using a fake Hitler quote, basically allowing himself to be carried away by the great oratory skills of a hate monger, there is still consequences for those actions. And part of those consequences will be social media heaping upon him all of the vitriol and anger possible. But as Lane Johnson said, and if he's serious about this as an opportunity for Deshaun to grow and a learning experience, I hope Deshaun comes out of this as an advocate against this hate. And I think that's where the difference is. I understand, again, where Lane's coming from, but I wish he would have come out a little more strongly like Chris Long did. To me, none of this is a reflection on Deshaun's character. This is a reflection on his judgment and his better sensibilities. The Eagles got to punish him somehow, whether it's a suspension, whether it's a fine, whatever it may be. But I think because this is the Eagles and because it's not an organization, Desean Jackson's very fortunate. Because if this was another organization, the situation may be either more complicated or handled a lot more inappropriately. Because Jeff Lurie is the owner, because of the reputation he has with the players, I think this situation can be handled much better and much more professionally and gracefully. And while some of us, like myself, feel like the situation is moving at a snail's pace, I should say, I understand that there is nuance and there's layers to this. But at some point, Deshaun needs to become the voice against the same hate that he was propagating earlier in the week, like Michael Vick became that voice as well. And listen, there's a huge difference between Riley Cooper and Desean Jackson. Because I know a lot of people say, well, Riley Cooper said this. Yeah, but you know what the difference was? Riley Cooper doesn't have the same marquee name and pedigree as an athlete that Desean Jackson is. Riley Cooper doesn't have the years of helping homeless people that Desean Jackson does, or helping youth in schools get books and supplies. Desean Jackson has done things in the community showing the quality of person that he is. And to me, that's the difference between him and Riley Cooper. And as Adam Kaplan and Lane Johnson and Chris Long all said, Desean Jackson's a good person. And I think that's why things are going to be able to move forward. Not just because he's going to be contrite and apologize and do everything necessary, but because deep down he's a good quality person who already has a background in doing good things in the community. I've seen the videos of Desean Jackson feeding homeless people. I don't think that's a person who has hate in his heart in general. But that's just my perspective. Text board is open, 609-403-0973. We'll dive into UFC 251 coming up next with Brett Okamoto from ESPN. I want to remind you that today is your opportunity. Seize the deal. Each week we've been giving you these seize the deal opportunities here on 97.3 ESPN. And today, you can get a $25 gift card for Yuri's Waterfront Restaurant in the Boathouse at the foot of the bridge in Wildwood for half price. That's right, $25 gift card for half the price, but you got to get on the 97.3 ESPN mobile app to get this deal with seizethedeal.com. Hurry, chances are this will sell out. These are great opportunities for amazing restaurants in our area. Listen, if you're going to go out and get food out, whether it's takeout or if you're going to eat out in one of those nice outdoor settings, why not take it to one of the local businesses like Yuri's Waterfront Restaurant and the Boathouse Restaurant at the foot of the bridge in Wildwood. $25 gift card, half price. Hit up the 97.3 ESPN app right now to get in on this deal before it sells out. $25 gift card, half price. 97.3 ESPN app. Do it now. Josh Hennig back here on the warm-up on 97.3 ESPN. Get to your text a little bit later in the hour, 609-403-0973. But joining us now on the Boardwalk Honda hotline, UFC 251 over on UFC Fight Island has not one, not two, but three title fights on the card. Of course, exclusively on ESPN Plus pay-per-view. And to join us now to talk more about it, Brett Okamoto, ESPN MMA reporter. Brett, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, man. We're a day away from some pretty good fights here at UFC 251.
Absolutely. And obviously we got to talk about the main event because, you know, it was just a week ago that we thought it was going to be Usman versus Burns, And a week later, we get Masvidal versus Usman. I mean, just talk about the wild last several days and how we flipped from one to the other in a way that I think a lot of people were wondering, will we ever see Masvidal fight Usman? And we're finally getting what the fans really wanted.
Yeah, that's what's crazy about the whole thing is that this was the fight that should have happened from the beginning, quite frankly. I mean, if you go back to February, which feels like, at least to me, and I'm sure to a lot of people out there, it feels like ages and ages ago, February. But, these two were on Super Bowl row and jawing back and forth with one another. I mean, this seemed like the obvious fight to make. Usman was a champion and Masvidal was coming off of one of the best years that anyone has ever put together in this sport, just in terms of his performances, knocking out Darren Till, Ben Askren in 5 seconds, and then beating Nate Diaz in New York. I mean, it was just everything was pointing to, hey, this was the next welterweight championship fight. But then Masvidal got in a contract dispute with the UFC, and in the meantime, this Gilbert Burns guy went on a run, and the UFC was fine moving forward with that fight. But then Burns tested positive for COVID. When he came to Las Vegas, he was going to get on a plane to Abu Dhabi. I mean, that's how close this thing was to Gilbert Burns getting his title shot instead of Masvidal. But obviously, that test comes back positive, and at that point, the UFC and its fighters, they tend to get deals done in crunch time. I mean, these guys like to jump at opportunities, and the UFC, to their credit, they like to put together big fights that people want to see. So they made it work. They got this deal done within a matter of 24 hours, and now we've got, I think, a much bigger fight, quite frankly.
And also a fight that I think a lot of the casual fans are also going to be attracted to, because in many ways, thanks to Masvidal's rise, he has become a superstar on a level that I think a lot of people are going to be more drawn to want to see this matchup because, of his personality, how he talks, his story. I mean, he's the kind of guy that, if you're the UFC, you're even more excited to have him on the card because all the eyeballs are going to be there.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it sounds like we're putting Gilbert Burns down, but we're not. And I think Gilbert's even aware of it. I mean, he knows that Jorge Masvidal is just a star. And in the UFC, it's not easy to become a star. I mean, it's kind of interesting that once you become a star, then you're sort of maintain it. You stay one, even if you go on a losing streak. It sort of doesn't matter. I mean, once people are really invested in you, they tend to stay that way. But it takes time, and it takes a lot of things to fall in the right place to reach that status. And Masvidal, I mean, the guy's been fighting for 17 years professionally. He's been fighting his whole life, basically. And it was only last year that he really hit that status, but he has certainly hit it at this point. Like to your point, casual fans who don't really follow the UFC on a daily basis, maybe they were intrigued by Fight Island. Maybe they were intrigued by, hey, there's not a ton of sports going on. Maybe I'll watch 3 title fights. But those casual fans, they're like, wait a second, that Masvidal guy? Yeah, I've heard of him. I know him. I will tune into this. So the card is much bigger than it was 7 days ago. There's no question.
When we look at the actual matchup, we know Usman is a phenomenal athlete. He's got the power wrestling. But what does Masvidal have in his game to be able to, shall I call it, counter what Usman brings to the table, which is a set of tools that are at an extremely high level?
I think first and foremost is experience and fight IQ. Masvidal has fought anybody and everybody under the sun. He's faced every single type of style there is. And he's never really gotten blown out. You look over the course of his career, and this guy, if you backtrack, a year and a half, no one was really thinking that Masvidal was championship material, but everybody knew how tough Masvidal was, and no one had an easy fight with Masvidal. I mean, the losses that he had were tended to be very, very close. So he's just a guy that just knows how to be in a fight, how to avoid taking damage. And unfortunately for him, over the course of many years, he just couldn't really win the big one. He couldn't string together a ton of performances that would really catapult him into the mainstream. But then he did in 2019. So I think the biggest challenge that Usman is facing is he's fighting a guy who will not be intimidated by the moment, who is coming in very loose, who is coming in extremely confident, and who is a really, really intelligent fighter. And he's a better wrestler than he gets credit for. I mean, anybody who thinks that Usman's just going to wrestle Masvidal to the ground, I mean, who knows? These fights are unpredictable all the time, but that's not what I see happening. I think Usman's going to have to bring a well-rounded, full set of skills in order to beat somebody like Jorge Masvidal.
Brett Okamoto joining us here on the Boardwalk on the Hotline on 97.3 ESPN. Make sure you're following him on Twitter for all of your UFC and MMA news on Twitter at beat Okamoto, ESPN. Brett, the other thing with this Usman Masvidal fight that I'm curious about is no matter who wins, is the UFC going to give the winner to Gilbert Burns, or is there going to be a situation where Burns might have to, maybe have a number one contender fight? What do you think would be the aftermath of the winner of this fight, who they would face next?
Yeah, I think if Usman wins, then it's back to Gilbert Burns, and that's great. I mean, Gilbert Burns has looked so phenomenal. I want to see him fight for a championship. And if it's Usman, I think it will be Burns. If it's Masvidal, I do not think it will be Burns. And the reason I say that is just because at that point, Masvidal will have reached that rarefied air, man. It doesn't happen very often. But when you are an absolute superstar and your stock is as high as it can get, and you're holding a UFC championship, I mean, you can demand the fights you want. You can call for the big money fight. Jorge Masvidal is not going to go from the year that he had in 2019 and then taking a title on 6 days' notice against Kamaru Usman to just facing the number one contender that again, I say this respectfully, that not enough people care about yet. Maybe someday people will really, truly care about Gilbert Burns because he has the skills and he's an entertaining fighter when he's inside the octagon, but he just doesn't have that name recognition yet. So it's not going to happen. I just don't see Masvidal fighting Gilbert Burns. I am of the opinion that the UFC has got to do anything it can do to make Conor McGregor versus Jorge Masvidal. If Masvidal wins, and he is coming off a situation in which he won a title on 6 days, and he can call out Conor McGregor, and that's a fight that I think Conor McGregor would have interest in because now he doesn't have to go against this big wrestler guy that's going to, take him down for 5 rounds. And Usman, he's going to face a guy that's going to strike with him and Jorge Masvidal. Maybe the two biggest stars in the sport at that point. You could add in Khabib Nurmagomedov. He's up there as well. But you'd have the two fighters who are the hottest right now, Masvidal and McGregor. You got to make that fight if Masvidal wins.
So logistically, if I can just follow you down that rabbit hole, if Masvidal wins, he calls out McGregor, let's say, what kind of timetable are we looking at? Because it seems like the UFC is a train that just can't be stopped right now in terms of being able to keep these fights going, no matter if it's in Vegas or on Fight Islands. But what would actually be a timetable for that? Because I assume that McGregor wants to have a fight camp, and I assume that Masvidal would like a little time to, talk up the fight and promote it. So what will we think about logistically in terms of location and a timetable?
I mean, I think end of the year, but then it also kind of brings into question of, and this has been a topic that has sort of been hovering around this pandemic, is that with the loss of a gate, that's a significant loss. I mean, if you're talking about what I think would probably be the biggest fight in UFC history, I mean, you have that fight here in Vegas, or you have it somewhere, I don't think it would happen here, but Abu Dhabi, with the Middle East, some type of site fee. You're talking about a lot of money that is being lost because you can't have fans in the building for a fight like that. So that might come into play in the negotiations, but I think just from a competitive standpoint, those two would be willing and able to fight each other by the end of the year. And that obviously would be a ridiculous way to end off 2020.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to touch on the other two title fights on the card with you as well, Brett. The fight that I'm looking forward to most, no matter what, when this was announced, was Volkanovski versus Holloway too, because this was a fight when they first fought. I think a lot of people looked at that and they were like, this was a fairly even fight. And to see Holloway, who people believe was on his way to being one of the greatest 145-pound fighters, to then lose at 145 to a guy that I think a lot of people, the casual fan, shall I say, didn't expect to happen, is a huge deal. So talk about what can we expect from this rematch?
That's a good question. That's a very good question, because Holloway is in a position now that we haven't seen him in a ton, right, over the course of his career. Because he's been so good, he's in a position where he has to make a lot of adjustments. He has to come in and fight differently than he did the first time, because I was of the opinion that Volkanovski was pretty much in control of that fight. Not to say that it was just a throwaway, non-competitive fight, but I just felt like Alex was in control for the most part. So if that is the case, then Max needs to make changes, right? Well, how do you make changes when you're in the midst of a global pandemic that Max Holloway is taken very seriously? I mean, he's been one of those guys who has been advocating for staying at home and social distancing and to take this very seriously. So, his camp was a non-traditional one. It wasn't one in which he could really get in the gym with a different bodies and execute these adjustments that he needs to make. He's going to have to do those with, a very non-traditional camp. So I think that he's talented, obviously enough. He's smart enough. He's young enough to make those changes, but it certainly is a challenge. And that's the biggest That's the biggest question going into this fight. That's $1 million question is how is Max going to change what happened in the first fight? Because he definitely lost that fight in my mind. So he needs to make changes. Can he do so? Because Alex right now, I'm sure he's got adjustments in his back pocket, and he's got plan B's and C's, but it's the pressure to change things is not on him. It's on Max.
Physically, we know that Max is at least the bigger, quote unquote, bigger fighter because he's 5'11". Volkanovski's like 5'6", 5'7". So is that something that Max can use to his advantage a little bit better and say, listen, I'm the taller guy. I'm in some ways maybe the bigger guy. How can he possibly use that to his advantage?
I mean, that's a question that's better answered, I think, by coaches than me. But I'll say just my personal opinion watching the fight. I don't think it's going to make a difference in terms of, where we think like Max could really use his reach and stay on the outside and hit him with a jab here and there. I just think Alex is too good at closing the distance. His wrestling is good. His head movement's good. I think that regardless of what Max does, Alex is going to find his ways on the inside at times, right? So I think the way that Max could use his size is in the clinch, though. I mean, to be able to when those distances close, to grab a hold of Alex and maybe hit him with some offense that's in tight, rather than because that's something that Alex did very well. He landed that low leg kick when the fight was on the outside, and then he was effective when he's pressing forward. So if Max can hurt him, when he tries to press forward, well then it might give Alex a little bit of hesitation to come in, and then potentially he can use his length to his advantage a little bit more. But that's something that I'll be looking for in this fight, is that when the fight is in close, does that automatically mean that the advantage goes to the smaller guy who wants it to be in close in Alex, or can Max kind of turn that table?
And Brett, the third title fight on the card, the 135-pound belt. We will have a new champion this weekend, Peter Yan versus Jose Aldo. And I think some people like myself were initially surprised that Aldo actually has been able to make it down to 135 now multiple times. And Peter Yan is one of the up-and-coming stars at that weight class. So to me, this is really comes down to, in some ways, the old guard versus the new guard.
Yeah, true. And it's a huge opportunity for Peter Yan. I mean, if you can't really draw it up any better. Of course, it would have been great to see him fight Henry Cejudo, but Cejudo retired. He walked away. Maybe he'll be back. Maybe he won't. But you look at this situation for Peter Yan. He's fighting on a card that is, this Fight Island intrigue type card, and now you add Masvidal in there. There's a lot of attention being placed on this card. It's a high-profile card. So for, a guy who, like you said, has been looked at as an up-and-comer, has looked at potentially the future of the division, for him to have his first title fight against a well-established name. There's not many more well-established names in terms of everybody knows how good this guy is, and Jose Aldo. If he goes out and makes a statement against Aldo, potentially knocks him out, and starts his title reign at 135 pounds in that manner, you're talking about a massive, massive opportunity to get him off on the right foot. So I think that's what a lot of people are expecting, quite frankly, is for Peter Yan to win this fight. But, hey, man, Aldo's been here a million times. He knows how to win these fights. So, that's a very, very interesting one. But it's a huge opportunity for the guy who's coming in, and he's the younger one.
Yeah, on the flip side, the story that fascinates me so much is Aldo, because this is the guy, he wasn't just the king of 145. For those who don't know, Brett, he was dominant at 145 for such a long time. And it almost seems like he's gotten forgotten about. And what does it mean for him if he can be the 135-pound champ years after he had that dominant run at 145?
Yeah. I think that unless Aldo, really goes out and makes a huge statement and then follows that up with more wins in this division, I still think that, his peak and his prime is most likely behind him. Again, this is not, I can't predict the future. And if he's able to win this belt and hang on to it a little while longer, obviously that will mean a great deal to his legacy. But I think it's a way to really kind of continue to put in the past that loss to Conor McGregor, because that's really when things changed for Aldo, right? And that's been years now. It's been years since the guy was on top, the king of the mountain for so long, and then he gets knocked out in 13 seconds by Conor McGregor, and he still has never quite completely come back from that. Even when he recaptured the title and beat Frankie Edgar, just things were never the same. So if he's able to come back and say, I won a championship at another division. I became a two-weight champion, and I did it by dropping down when so many people figured that I would eventually move up. It just continues to kind of put to bed what I got to believe is still the most disappointing and heartbreaking loss of his career, and that was to Conor McGregor.
Absolutely. Brett, before I let you go, and I appreciate the time as always, I found it very interesting. You put the tweets out earlier that you talked to someone from the Abu Dhabi Department of agriculture and tourism, and I thought it was interesting that what they had to say about the arena and the possibility that we could actually see people in the arena for these fights, whereas the UFC Apex was more of a sterile environment.
Yeah, and it would still be a sterile environment. I found that interesting too, because, and it's honestly something that I hadn't really thought of before, but I should have. I mean, you got this bubble, right? You've got this big bubble over in Abu Dhabi, and all these people who are in there have been tested. Otherwise they wouldn't be in there. So you've had, prior to everybody coming over and this thing being up and running, you had a bunch of, construction workers and things of that nature, building this thing and setting up the infrastructure of it. And now what you've got is you've got restaurants, and you've got, the hotels, and you've got security, and you've got all these people who are there in order to make this thing run. Well, they're still there. They're still in that bubble. The UFC has another event coming up on next Wednesday. So all these people are still there. So could you take some of those people and bring them into the arena and let them watch the fights? You absolutely could. Now, I don't think that's going to happen this weekend, because they're being cautious. They're being overly cautious for these first few. But I think as this scenario becomes, it feels a little bit more normal. And even if the UFC goes back in the fall, which there are definitely discussions to do that, I think you could see a situation in which we could have a little bit of an atmosphere that is more like what we're used to. And I've seen some people on Twitter say, hey, I like the quiet fights. That's cool, but I don't. I want people to be there and appreciate them. And I want, if a guy wins a championship, I want there to be some noise around them. I would like that. So just personally. So it's a very interesting concept. It's something that I think is very realistic that we could see happen, that people could be around and be actually making noise during these fights.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. I know you'll be following all of that as well as the rest of the month for UFC Fight Island. Folks, follow Brett on Twitter at Okamoto ESPN. Brett Okamoto, ESPN MMA reporter, and as all guests, he appeared on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Brett, always appreciate your time.
You guys, Josh, enjoy the fights, man.
You too. Again, UFC 251, not one, not two, but three title fights tomorrow night. ESPN Plus pay-per-view. You're not going to want to miss out, because these are arguably some of the best fighters the UFC has to offer, and for title fights. And, of course, a stacked card up and down all the way as well. Warm up, Josh Hennig, 97.3 ESPN. We'll wrap up the show coming up on the other side. Josh Hennig back here on the warm up 97.3 ESPN. I'm going to remind you, today is the day. We've been telling you about it all week. Seize the deal. This week, seize the deal. $25 gift card. Yuri's Waterfront Restaurant in the Boathouse Restaurant in the Foot of the Bridge in Wildwood. Half price. That's right. So you pay half the price, and you get a $25 gift card, good for use, at both Yuri's Waterfront Restaurant and the Boathouse Restaurant at the Foot of the Bridge in Wildwood. This deal is there now for you to get. Don't miss out. These are great opportunities for you to treat yourself to some great local businesses. $25 gift card, Yuri's Waterfront Restaurant, the Boathouse, for the Bridge in Wildwood. Half the price. Right now, go to the 97.3 ESPN mobile app. Also, right now, over in the mobile app at 97.3ESPN.com. One of the things Mike Gill, Sports Bash, Hunter Brody talk about, latest news with high school football. Start date changed. Obviously, because of the pandemic, everything's getting pushed back or canceled or delayed. You want to stay tuned. Mike McGarry from the Press of Atlantic City talk more about it. Check it out on the website or on the app, 97.3ESPN.com, 97.3 ESPN mobile app. Latest news, October 2nd is the start for, tentatively, for high school football. For more information, go to the website right now, 97.3ESPN.com. Mike McGarry, Press of Atlantic City, will join the guys coming up at 2:30. Thanks again to Brett Okamoto for joining us there. And this UFC 251 is such a massive, massive fight card. And I can't let go, though, of what Okamoto said, though, because he dropped it totally on, I didn't talk to him about it before the interview. Him and I weren't texting this back and forth. He just dropped it out of nowhere. Oh, by the way, if Masvidal wins, expect it to be Masvidal versus McGregor. I'm sorry, what? Just came out of left field with that howitzer right there. And the reason that's significant is because, as Brett mentioned, you have a superstar in the making right now in Masvidal. And if you can get the biggest moneymaker in the UFC, McGregor, to come back and fight Masvidal, that would be huge. But as Brett mentioned, what do you do if there's no attendance? And I think that's where the rub is. Because of this pandemic, I don't expect we're going to see fans in attendance for a while for any sporting event. You're seeing the PGA Tour have been announcing that they were going to originally let fans attend, and now they're telling them they can't attend now. They're slowly, each event, saying, nope, no fans, nope, no fans. And while it's a cool idea that for the UFC Fight Island fights that they would maybe let in, the security and the hotel staff and everyone working in the bubble to attend the fights and make a small crowd of maybe 1,000 people all around the ring to get a little bit of, vibrant life in attendance. That's not the same as selling out a 20,000 person seat arena with people screaming their heads off to the point where the announcers can't even hear themselves because McGregor and Masvidal are going to go head to head after trash talking for weeks on end. And I think that's where the concern for the UFC is going to have to be met full on, because you don't want to waste an opportunity with a huge super fight like that. You're already losing the fans for fights like this card. And for next month with Cormier versus Miocic 3. This is the rubber match. Whoever wins this match wins the series between Miocic and Cormier at heavyweight. And frankly, it's probably going to be a legacy win because whoever wins between Cormier and Miocic is all going to go down as the greatest heavyweight in UFC history, but there's not going to be a bunch of fans in attendance for it. So I don't know what the UFC does there. If Masvidal beats Usman tomorrow night, do you try to push back that fight as far as possible to hope you maybe get fans? I don't know. It's a very interesting position the UFC is going to be in. I'm looking forward to the fights tomorrow night, but man, there's going to be some massive ripple effects. Whoever wins these belts tomorrow night for UFC 251.